if it's all right, just to begin with the history of Flare, and if you could just tell us a little bit about how it all began.
Sure. So, BFI Flare is one of the world's most important and long-standing LGBTIQ plus film festivals. And it all started in 1977. I was there. I was in London just by accident before I was going up to university. And there was a screening of 35 full-length feature films under the heading of Images of Homosexuality. And I thought, oh my God, I have to see this. And I thought this is something that all big cities had. Little did I know that it was one of the first, probably the second in the world, have a major cinematheque screening queer films under a banner festival heading. So that was 1977. The BFI didn't really build on that great work until 9 years later, when they ran a season called Gay's Own Pictures, and it was inspired by a programmer from Newcastle upon Tyne who had the idea, and a programmer from the BFI took the idea and the films from Newcastle, and thus the festival as we know it was really born. It changed its name to the London Lesbian and Gay Film Festival a couple of years later, and it's been going every year but one since 1986. So this is the 35th year. 3 years ago, I think we changed the name to BFI Flare, LGBTIQ plus Film Festival, because we didn't feel the previous iteration was inclusive enough. And we love BFI Flare. It's a beacon, it shines a light. And many people tell us that they feel it's like Christmas for the queers. There's so much good fun things happening there.
Yeah.
But it's a very broad program, and it's not just serious, it's not just erotic, it's not just funny, it's all of those things and much, much more. We aim to show the best in queer cinema from around the world, and really for the first time this year, because of the pandemic, we're not screening any films in cinemas, but actually that's an advantage for people all across the UK, that they can see films from the 17th to the 28th any time of day. You can have your porridge with some of the free short films, or you can have your cocoa after midnight with a great documentary. It's great. 26 films in just 9 or 10 days.
Just a little bit about yourself and growing up.
So I grew up in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. I met my first gay person in the summer of 1975. So there was a lot of other things going on in Northern Ireland. It was politically very difficult. There was a lot of violence, bombs were going off. I had to lie to my parents because they didn't want me going off to Belfast, and they certainly didn't want me going to a Belfast Gay Liberation Society meeting. But I managed it, and I was really inspired by the people that I met there. And before that, I'd gone to the library and gone to the shelf reference that was Dewey Decimal 301.4157, where there were books on sexual deviance and sexual abnormalities. And a lot of them were very medical, but there were some really interesting ones. And I was very inspired by the notion of gay culture. And in a book called Homosexual Oppression and Liberation, there was a list of queer films in the back. And I thought, well, I really want to see all of these. And so then a few years later, when I came to London and came to the BFI's then National Film Theatre, I thought I really want to be a part of this. And so I set up a film society for gay people at my university, the University of Sussex. And then I became a member of the BFI when I moved to London. And a few years later, I spent 30 years working for the BFI as a full-time press officer. But then in my free time, I was lucky enough to be able to program for the the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival from, I think, 1999. So I've been to every single edition of the festival and many other festivals worldwide. But I think what's really important about a queer film festival is really that it teaches you about other people's lives and histories you may not know. And that's very empowering, and it's good for self-esteem and to let you know that there are others who've gone before you, that you're not alone. It's also a very good place to meet people. We know many people who've had very long-term relationships through people they've met. And I always like to say to my audiences that the most exciting thing you can say to someone after you've seen a film is hello, or what did you think of the film? And conversation will either flow or it doesn't. But it's very nice to be somewhere where alcohol isn't necessarily a part of the equation, where sex isn't necessarily automatically on the agenda, and that people can be relaxed and share things about their lives and be an audience. It's great when you're in a cinema with, you know, people from their teens into their 80s or 90s, and then we're all laughing along at the same film or gasping at the same documentary. So yes, I love a film festival.
During your time at the BFI, to talk about the milestones that have been achieved within film and art.
I mean, the first edition of the festival in 1986 was really operating against a background of oppression, and Clause 28 was coming out of the statute book. And some people thought it would be illegal for the festival to go ahead. So it's always thrived on controversy and kind of tried to step out of the box of normality. So that's a very big milestone, really, getting the first edition off the ground. But I think there are many initiatives that happen, but sustaining it year after year after year, I think we are one of the longest running queer LGBTIQ plus cultural events that are within a national institution. So all kinds of people do all kinds of different things, but 35 years means that you build up an audience, that the AIDS epidemic, which was 5 years old in 1986, has been a constant source of subjects of films, some of the very memorable films. Right from the first program, there was Arthur Bresson did a film called An Early Frost. I think that's right, definitely in the first program. And then we've had, 20 years later, we've had films like We Were Here by David Weissman, and a film that I was just discussing earlier, How to Survive a Plague by David France, that anyone who's seen It's a Sin, the Russell T Davies Channel 4 program, will realize that the 80s and 90s were very difficult, dangerous, but also inspiring times to be in the gay world. And we've shown the films to go along with that.
The program for this year's festival, what films stood out for you?
An absolute standout for me is PS.Burn This Letter Please, which is a wonderful documentary about a cache of letters that was discovered by a man in California. And he realized that these letters were written by drag queens to a man living in New York. And he thought, this is amazing. These are drag queens from the 1950s, when it was illegal to be gay, it was illegal to wear women's clothing, it was illegal to perform in public as a man in women's clothing. And yet there's this whole group of people who are corresponding with each other. And he hired a private detective and tracked down the original writers of these letters and found about maybe as many as 9 or 10 mostly gay men who were in their 80s and 90s, who were astonishing survivors. And so it's a really major thing that these guys, most of whom didn't have the internet, let alone a mobile phone, that they were able to track them down just on the basis of the name Daphne or Georgie or Heidi, or and their testimony is very moving about how it was to resist in a world which didn't want you to have any form of social or cultural expression, that they just did it. They dressed up, they got arrested, they stole, they sold their bodies, they went on stage, they just didn't take it. They did what they wanted to do, and some of them are still performing, even in their 80s, which is truly inspirational. Another film I really love is a film that's a world premiere of, it's called FireBird, and it's a love story between a young junior officer and a fighter pilot, and it's set in the Soviet era Estonia, and it's based on a true story, and it's got a fantastic performance by Tom Pryor, who some of you may recognize when he played alongside Eddie Redmayne in a film I've forgotten. But he's a really one to watch, and he's a very talented young man. And it's a very moving story about people finding love against the odds. There's a brilliant documentary about women in the 80s, mostly lesbians or bisexual, who were creating new ways of being, that they were sexually adventurous, they wore leather, they shaved their heads, they had piercings, and they had a lot of fun. And this film is called Rebel Dykes, and it's probably the fastest selling film in the festival, so it's sold out. Cured, which is, it sounds a bit dry, it's about the American Psychiatric Association in 1974. They changed their ruling on what constituted mental illness, and homosexuality was designated until 1974 as a mental illness, that you were considered abnormal, deviant, and socially and sexually dangerous if you were a practicing homosexual. And this film tells the fabulous story, with lots of survivors, of people who took on the establishment of the American Psychiatric Association and got them to change that law. And there's one moment in it where a gay psychiatrist addresses their annual conference in a clown mask, and they could not believe that there would be such a thing as a gay psychiatrist. And lots of others followed them, and they changed the world. Because if your definition of mentally ill and socially dangerous and criminal is homosexual, then that means we're all criminals. And so the film's title, Cured, is an indication of their towering achievement. There's also a whole lot of great shorts, which I would recommend anyone to dip in, and they're free. All the shorts are free. So you can just watch one whenever you have 5 or 10 minutes free, and you can come back to it if you get interrupted. You can spend the whole of the festival just watching shorts, but do pay for some tickets as well.
Another film I wanted to ask was AIDS Diva, The Legend of Connie Norman. And just for those of us who don't know Connie, who was she? And, what did she stand for?
Connie was an AIDS activist in Los Angeles, and a trans woman who was very outspoken and really helped people and created a sense of community in a really powerful way. And that personality comes across really wonderfully in the film, and it's hugely beautiful and inspiring how she was able to help people and change many people's lives. It's a kind of unsung hero of the AIDS epidemic, of whom there were many, but Connie's a particularly memorable one.
Just a quick note about 5 Films for Freedom. If we could just get your thoughts on that.
5 Films for Freedom is an incredible project that was mounted by the British Council working with the BFI to choose 5 films, mostly quite short films, under 10 minutes, that are available to view for free all over the world. And we have been astonished by the appetite around the world. We know from our internet data that there are people from Afghanistan to Zambia, from Honolulu to Australia, that all across the world, people are interested. And they're a mixed bag of powerful films that just give people a sense of another world that they may not be familiar with. And it's a fabulous collaboration between the British Council and the BFI, and it's something that we're really honoured to be involved in selecting the films each year. One from a previous year remains in the memory really vividly, was about a man who ran a helpline for gay farmers, because if you're a farmer, you don't have the energy or the ability to get to gay clubs, and you're often very distant from other people. People don't understand that you have to be up at dawn to deal with the milking or the lambs or the pigs or the cows or the goats, and you can't be just running off to discos at the drop of a hat. And so this helpline and sort of social group was really useful for gay farmers. So it's kind of charming and sweet and wonderful, and takes you to a place that mostly you've never been to. And I think that kind of sums up the project.
Brian, you've met so many people along the way, from people such as Bette Davis to Woody Allen to Tarantino and many others. Could you give a name of a few people who really stood out for you, and what it was like meeting them?
Having dinner with Quentin Crisp, I have to say, which is before I ever got involved in the gay film world, was very exciting. That I'd seen him in A Naked Civil Servant, and when I went to dinner at the Belfast Gay Liberation Society special dinner, I was kind of taken aback that he wasn't actually John Hurt, that he seemed like an old man, whereas John Hurt had played a glamorous and beautiful redhead. But Quentin was then, I think, in his mid to late 60s, but he was very flamboyant and exciting and interesting. I mean, I have met a lot of people. I think interviewing Dame Julie Andrews on stage was a big career highlight for me, for the 40th anniversary of the release of The Sound of Music. But I'd say filmmakers are really very wonderful people. David Weissman and the Coquettes, he's a really talented filmmaker. And in a festival, sometimes people come around again and again with films. So the films of Jacques Martineau and Olivier Ducastel, they're really, really great people and fun to be around. Actually, other festival programmers are great fun to be around, that we share our knowledge, we recommend things to people, and we attend each other's festivals. Sometimes you hear something about a film that's on the way from a filmmaker, and then, hey presto, you've got a world premiere next season. And it's a joy to know so many filmmakers, some of whom I count as friends. And it's great when you love their films too.
For those in the future who would like to submit a film to BFI Flare, can you give any advice? What do you look for within a film?
I think we are always looking for stories that haven't been told. There are some stories that reappear and can be retold again and again and again. A shy boy who's uncertain of himself, who falls in love, who discovers the gay world. Well, that's a story that we have actually seen before, but sometimes it can be told in such a beautiful and charming way that you feel as if you haven't seen it before. But documentaries that take us to countries or cultures where we learn something that isn't maybe widely known in the mainstream, historical events that are explored, and the stories of people's lives, that's great. But it doesn't have to be expensively produced. It just has to have care taken to every bit of the craft of filmmaking, that a great idea can be very simple. And if you pay attention to lighting, script, all the production values, and prepare it carefully, don't make your shorts too long, don't make your features too short or too long. That would be my advice. So
Okay.
Tell a good story, make it interesting, and make it cinematic. Use pictures to tell the story.